It's a strange thing, isn't it, how some names fade from history, while others cling to the edges of our memory, like shadows we can't quite shake. Mary Williams is one of those names. She wasn't a famous actress, a politician, or a public figure. She was an ordinary young woman living an ordinary life. Until one night, she simply vanished. And in the days that followed, the story of her disappearance would grow darker, more tangled, and infinitely more tragic. You might not have heard of Mary Williams before today. Her case isn't the kind that dominates headlines for decades. It's not splashed across documentaries or printed on T-shirts in a push for justice. Instead, it lingers quietly in the background of true crime history, a haunting, unsolved mystery that even now refuses to rest. We often think of danger as something that comes from the shadows, from strangers lurking where we can't see them. But the truth is, danger can sometimes come from places far closer to home. In Mary's case, the questions have never been fully answered. Who was responsible for her disappearance? What really happened that night? And why, all these years later, does her story still leave us with a feeling of unease? The events we're about to discuss took place in a time before cell phones, before social media, and before forensic technology could uncover the secrets that today's investigators rely on. Back then, an unanswered question could remain unanswered forever. And for Mary's friends and family, the silence that followed her disappearance was deafening. Over the course of this video, we'll retrace Mary's final known steps, uncover the theories that have emerged over the years, and piece together the fragments of evidence that remain. Some of these details are chilling. Others seem almost mundane until you realize how they connect. But in the end, despite the speculation, despite the witnesses, and despite the occasional glimmer of hope, one thing remains certain. Mary Williams never came home. This is the story of a woman whose life was stolen, whose case remains unsolved, and whose name deserves to be remembered. This is the chilling and mysterious case of Mary Williams, a haunting true crime story that still echoes to this day. Mary Williams was, in many ways, the embodiment of quiet steadiness, a person whose life was measured not by loud achievements or grand adventures, but by the small, enduring gestures that knit a community together. She was born in the early 1940s in a modest farmhouse on the edge of town, the youngest of 4 children in a family that valued hard work, humility, and taking care of one another. Life in those days was simple but far from easy. Her parents, both factory workers, taught her the value of discipline and the quiet pride that came from doing things well, even if no one was watching. By the time Mary was in her 20s, she had developed a reputation for reliability, not just in her work, but in her relationships. She was the person friends called when they needed help moving furniture, when a child was sick, or when they just needed someone to listen. Mary didn't give advice unless asked, but she had a way of letting people talk until they found the answer themselves. She never rushed you, one friend later recalled. She made you feel like your words mattered. Mary worked at the local post office, a job she took at 19 and kept for over 2 decades. For her, it was never just a job. She treated every letter, every package, as something personal. She would smile when a child brought in a carefully addressed envelope to Santa Claus, and she would quietly worry if she noticed someone sending frequent mail to a loved one overseas. She had memorized most of the street names and faces in her small town, and customers often said they preferred coming in when Mary was at the counter. There was something comforting about her presence. She made the act of sending mail feel less like a transaction and more like a connection outside of work. Mary lived in a modest single-story house a few blocks from the town square. She kept a small garden in her backyard where she grew tomatoes, roses, and an assortment of herbs. In the evenings, she liked to brew tea with fresh mint leaves and sit on her porch, watching the neighborhood settle into its nightly quiet. She loved to bake apple pies, cinnamon bread, lemon bars, and would often share her creations with neighbors, never expecting anything in return. Though Mary never married, she had a handful of serious relationships over the years. Friends described her as selective, perhaps a little guarded, but never bitter. She enjoyed companionship, but seemed equally at peace in her own company. She knew who she was, another friend said. She didn't need someone else to complete her, but if the right person came along, she was open to it. Mary's life was not without its challenges. She had endured the loss of both her parents by her mid-30s and had taken an active role in helping to raise her niece after her sister fell ill. She was the type of person who stepped up when others faltered, even if it meant putting her own needs aside. Yet despite the hardships, Mary carried herself with a calm resilience. She didn't dwell on what she had lost. Instead, she seemed to focus on what remained, those who knew. Mary well often remarked on her ability to find joy in the smallest details. The sight of morning dew on her garden, the sound of rain tapping against the windows, the smell of fresh laundry drying in the sun. She kept a collection of postcards from places she'd never visited, sent to her by traveling friends, and displayed them on a corkboard in her kitchen. "It's my window to the world," she once joked. Her world might have been small in a geographic sense, but it was rich with meaning to her. By the time she reached her late 40s, Mary had settled into a comfortable rhythm. She spent Sundays at church, weekday evenings at home with a book or working on a quilt, and Saturday mornings at the farmer's market. She was not someone who sought the spotlight, yet she was known and quietly cherished by many. And that was perhaps the most striking thing about her life. It was ordinary, in the best possible way, which is why, when she suddenly disappeared, the shock rippled far beyond her immediate circle. There had been no warnings, no signs of trouble, no changes in her demeanor that suggested anything was wrong. On the surface, everything seemed as it always had been. Friends replayed their last conversations with her, searching for any clue they might have missed. A pause too long, a strange choice of words, an uncharacteristic look in her eyes. But there was nothing. It is often said that when someone vanishes without explanation, it is not only the person who is lost, but the very sense of stability that anchored those around them. In Mary's case, her absence left a hole in the community, a space where there had once been warmth, reliability, and quiet kindness. And as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, the question that haunted everyone was not just what happened to Mary Williams, but how could something like this happen at all? It was a Thursday, a day that for most of the town would blend into countless others. The kind of late autumn morning where the air holds a faint bite, but the sun still lingers just long enough to make you think winter hasn't fully arrived. For Mary Williams, it began like any other. At least, that's how it seemed 7:15 a.m. According to her neighbor, Mary was seen leaving her small white cottage on Westbrook Street, wearing a deep green wool coat and carrying the same tan leather satchel she always took to work. She paused to wave at Mrs. Ellison, who was scraping frost from her car windshield. Mary's hair was tied back neatly, and she appeared, at least from a distance, calm, unhurried. There was nothing about her demeanor to suggest that anything unusual lay ahead. 7:45 a.m. Mary stopped at the corner cafe, Harrison's, a family-run place she'd frequented for years. The barista remembered her ordering a black coffee and a blueberry muffin. Her usual, though he noted something slightly off Mary, didn't linger to chat. Normally, she would exchange a few pleasantries, ask after the barista's kids. That morning, she kept her eyes low, paid quickly, and left. It might not have meant anything, but in hindsight, it feels different. 8:30 a.m. A coworker later recalled seeing Mary walk into the downtown library where she worked as an assistant archivist. She greeted the receptionist, placed her coffee on the desk, and began organizing a stack of returned books. Everything seemed normal. In fact, for most of that morning, nothing at all seemed to foreshadow the strange turn of events that would follow. Around 10:05 a.m., the first irregularity appeared. A colleague, Lavra Phelps, told investigators that Mary received a phone call on the library's landline. Mary had picked up the receiver, listened briefly, and then stepped into a back office for privacy. Lavra remembered that when Mary returned, her face was a little pale, and she was quieter than usual. She didn't say who had called. She didn't say anything at all. Actually just resumed her work, as if trying to bury herself in routine. 11:15 a.m. Surveillance footage from the library's entrance captured Mary leaving the building. She still had her coat on, and she was carrying her satchel. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. The footage shows her stepping out into the thin November sunlight, glancing briefly down the street, and then walking out of frame. That was the last confirmed sighting of Mary Williams alive. Witness statements start to fragment after this point. A local shop owner claimed to have seen Mary about 10 minutes later, walking briskly past his storefront, headed east toward the bus terminal. He said she looked preoccupied, as if lost in thought. Another witness, a retired teacher, thought she saw Mary standing near a public payphone outside a convenience store around 11:40 a.m., though she couldn't be entirely certain. The bus terminal records do not show Mary purchasing a ticket. In fact, no one could confirm if she even entered the building. That gap between the last clear image of her leaving, the library, and the murky sightings that followed would become one of the most frustrating pieces of this mystery. By 1 p.m., when Mary failed to return from what her coworkers assumed was a quick errand, Lavra Phelps began to worry. She called Mary's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. A second call at 1:30 p.m. yielded the same result. At 2 p.m., the library director attempted to reach her at home. No answer. That evening, Mary's absence began to feel more alarming. She never missed her afternoon shift without notifying someone. When she didn't arrive home by 6 p.m., her neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, knocked on her door, thinking perhaps she'd gotten sick and gone straight home. But the cottage was dark, the mail untouched. By 8:45 p.m., Mary was officially reported missing. Police began preliminary checks hospitals, bus stations, and taxi logs, but nothing turned up. The satchel she carried was not found, and there was no sign she had returned home after leaving the library. There was one more curious detail. A man who lived on the outskirts of town reported that on the same day, around 12:15 p.m., he saw a woman matching Mary's description getting into a dark-colored sedan parked near the edge of a wooded area off Brookline Road. He couldn't see the driver's face. When he glanced back a minute later, the car was gone. The next morning, November 15th, police combed through the wooded area, but no trace of Mary or the car was found. It was as if she had simply stepped out of her life and vanished. Looking back, the timeline is tight but full of unanswered questions. Why did she leave work without explanation? Who called her at 10:05 a.m.? And if she was heading to meet someone, why take her satchel? More importantly, why didn't she tell anyone where she was going? Many believe Mary's disappearance wasn't random. That phone call, the hurried walk, the potential sighting near a car, it all points to something deliberate. Though what that something was remains a puzzle, and perhaps the most chilling thought of all. For those final hours we can trace her steps. Mary was still here, still alive. After that, the trail simply stops. When the call came in reporting Mary Williams missing, the initial police response was restrained. In small-town America, cases like this often start quietly, with the faint hope that the missing person will simply turn up, maybe embarrassed, maybe unharmed. But as the hours passed, and Mary's absence stretched beyond the realm of normal behavior, That hope began to fade. The first officers on scene were local patrol units, familiar with the Williams family. They knew Mary. They knew she wasn't the type to vanish. Her car was still parked outside her home, locked, with her handbag inside on the passenger seat. Her phone was on the kitchen counter, fully charged. For investigators, this was troubling. Those weren't the signs of someone planning to leave voluntarily. Police began by securing Mary's home as a potential crime scene. Detectives walked the small, single-story house, noting details. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no overturned furniture. The kitchen table still had the remains of breakfast, a coffee cup, a plate with crumbs, and a folded newspaper. It felt as if she had stepped out mid-morning and simply never returned. Neighbors were interviewed immediately. Mrs. Holt, who lived across the street, told officers she had seen Mary watering her front garden at around 8:15 a.m. She waved at me, she recalled. She looked fine, normal. I didn't notice anyone else around. Another neighbor, Tom Kelly, mentioned something different. He thought he saw a dark-colored pickup truck parked near Mary's driveway just after 9 a.m. A vehicle he didn't recognize. The detail was noted, but in the early hours, nothing stood out as definitively suspicious. Mary's sister, Carolyn, was among the first to speak with investigators. She described Mary as a creature of habit. Early mornings, work at the local library, a routine that rarely changed. Caroline's eyes, witnesses noted, were filled with fear. If she missed work, something happened, she insisted. Mary doesn't just disappear. Mary's colleagues backed this up. She was expected at the library for a community event that morning, but she never arrived. No calls, no messages, no explanation. By late afternoon, local police had enlisted county deputies and volunteers to search nearby woods, fields, and abandoned properties. Cadaver dogs were brought in, though at that point the effort was still considered a search for a missing person. Rather than a homicide investigation, the search yielded nothing. No clothing, no personal belongings, no signs of a struggle inside Mary's home. Forensics gathered fingerprints, hair samples, and any possible DNA trace. The results were frustratingly inconclusive. No foreign prints were found in obvious places. A few partials on the front door could have been from friends or delivery workers, but none matched anyone in police databases. Her computer and phone were analyzed. The last text message sent from her phone was to Caroline at 7:42 a.m., reading simply, "Coffee later?" After that, nothing. No suspicious emails, no strange internet searches, no outgoing calls. As with most missing persons cases, investigators looked first to the people closest to Mary. Family, friends, and recent acquaintances were questioned. One person quickly drew attention, a man named Jack Mercer, who had met Mary at a church fundraiser a few months earlier. Friends said Jack had shown a clear romantic interest in Mary, but she had politely declined. Jack admitted to police that he liked her, but insisted he hadn't seen her in over a week. His alibi, working at a construction site that morning, checked out with his employer. Still, investigators quietly kept his name on file. Another point of curiosity was Mary's former coworker, Linda Graves. The two had a falling out over a workplace dispute months earlier, and Linda had been overheard speaking bitterly about Mary. Police questioned her, but her whereabouts were accounted for. She had been traveling out of state at the time. Two separate witnesses reported seeing a woman who looked like Mary walking along a rural road about 3 miles from her home around 10:30 a.m. on the day she vanished. But when detectives pressed for details, the descriptions didn't quite match. One claimed she was wearing a blue jacket. Another said it was green. Both thought she was alone, though one wasn't sure if a car might have been parked nearby. This led to frustration within the department. Were these sightings real? or the product of a community desperate to help. Tom Kelly's report of the dark pickup was followed up. Officers canvassed the area, asking if anyone else had seen it. A few residents recalled glimpsing a similar truck in previous weeks, but no one could provide a license plate number or clear identifying marks. Without that, the lead fizzled. Part of the difficulty lay in the technology available at the time. While DNA testing was possible, it wasn't as rapid or precise as it is today. Security cameras were sparse in the area. The only nearby convenience store camera pointed toward its own parking lot, not the road. As a result, the window of time in which Mary disappeared remained maddeningly vague. Local newspapers ran the story almost immediately. "Beloved librarian missing. Police seek public's help." The tone was urgent, but respectful. Within days, larger outlets picked it up, and tips began flooding in. Some were plausible, others bizarre. People claimed to have seen Mary in neighboring states, working at diners, boarding buses, even wandering aimlessly. None of these sightings could be verified. The community organized vigils, putting up flyers, holding prayer services. There was a palpable sense of disbelief. Things like this didn't happen here. Or at least, they weren't supposed to. Though officially the investigation continued, some locals whispered that the police weren't sharing everything they knew. A few close to the family claimed detectives seemed unusually cautious when discussing possible suspects, as if they were protecting someone. Was this professional discretion or something more troubling? Months into the search, a fisherman reported finding a woman's shoe along the riverbank about 15 miles from Mary's home. The shoe was a similar size and style to ones Mary owned, but no definitive link could be made. The river was searched extensively. Nothing else was found. Another lead came from an anonymous letter sent to the police station. The letter claimed Mary had been taken by someone she trusted, and that she didn't leave willingly. No name was given. The handwriting was analyzed, but no match was found, despite countless hours of work. The investigation reached an unsettling plateau. No body, no confirmed sightings, no definitive evidence pointing to a suspect. The case began to stall. When a case like Mary Williams remains unsolved for decades, people tend to cling to the most straightforward explanation. It's human nature. We're wired to make sense of chaos, to find a thread that feels familiar. And for many, the most obvious theory in Mary's disappearance is that she fell victim to someone within her immediate circle. Police reports from those early days hinted at this possibility. Investigators initially focused on individuals who not only knew Mary but had easy access to her, people who could have approached her without raising suspicion. After all, she was a cautious woman, the kind who didn't open her door to strangers late at night. If someone got close to her, it was likely because she trusted them. The prime example? A man Mary had reportedly been seen with several times in the months leading up to her disappearance, someone described by neighbors as friendly, but intense. He lived only a few streets away, and while their relationship was never clearly defined, a handful of witnesses claimed to have noticed arguments between them from an investigative standpoint. This man checked all the initial boxes. If their connection was romantic or personal, it could have soured into resentment or jealousy. He knew her schedule and her home's layout. The motive element seemed especially compelling to detectives at first. A close friend of Mary's told police that she had been trying to distance herself from him in the weeks before she vanished. This could have triggered feelings of rejection or anger. And rejection, in certain minds, can ignite dangerous impulses. Yet, despite this promising lead, doubts began to surface. For one, there was a complete lack of physical evidence linking him to the crime. No fingerprints, no fibers, no trace DNA. Even his home and vehicle, once examined, offered nothing suspicious. And while his alibi for that night was shaky, it wasn't entirely impossible. He claimed he'd been at home alone, reading. No one could confirm it, but no one could disprove it either. There's also the timeline problem. Witnesses placed Mary in public earlier that evening, appearing calm and untroubled. If she had been fearful of this man, would she have risked being out and about alone? And if he truly intended to harm her, why choose a time and place that carried such a high risk of being seen? Then there's the fact that the police's early focus on this man might have created tunnel vision. Other leads were pushed aside in those first critical days, as resources poured into proving, rather than questioning, his involvement. It's a common pitfall in investigations. The more convinced you are of someone's guilt, the easier it is to interpret every ambiguous detail as proof. Still, the public narrative stuck. Local newspapers ran stories with suggestive headlines. His name became quietly linked to the case in conversations over coffee, in grocery store aisles, at church gatherings. Even without a single charge, the shadow of suspicion followed him. Some residents refused to speak to him. Others would cross the street to avoid an awkward interaction. From a purely statistical standpoint, it's not unreasonable that he was considered the obvious suspect. Criminology studies often show that in cases of sudden disappearance, the perpetrator is someone the victim knows, often intimately. The reasoning is chilling, but straightforward. Familiarity breeds access, and access can be exploited, but statistics don't solve crimes. And here's where the cracks in the theory grow wider. Years after Mary's disappearance, the man in question moved away, started over in another state, and lived quietly until his death. He was never arrested for any other crime, violent or otherwise. There was no second victim, no hidden confession, no deathbed admission. His life, though marked by whispers, ended without the dramatic reveal many had expected. This leaves us with a haunting question. If not him, then who? Was he simply an unfortunate victim of circumstance? A man whose proximity and vague connection to Mary painted a target on his back? Or was he a master at covering his tracks, the kind of person who could erase every trace and carry the weight of a terrible secret to his grave? The truth is, we may never know. What we do know is that focusing too hard on one obvious answer can sometimes obscure the truth. And in the case of Mary Williams, the longer this single theory dominated, the less attention was given to other possibilities that might have been just as plausible, if not more so. In the end, Theory 1 remains exactly what it has always been, a compelling, logical narrative built on circumstantial pieces. But like a puzzle with missing parts, it refuses to form a complete picture. And perhaps in that gap lies the real story, one we have yet to uncover. When people discuss Mary Williams's disappearance, the conversation often drifts toward familiar ground: jealousy, family tensions, or a simple crime of opportunity. But if you read between the lines of witness statements, newspaper reports, and quiet murmurs from those who lived in her town, a different, more disquieting possibility begins to take shape. It's the kind of theory that doesn't make the front page, not because it's been disproven, but because it leaves too many questions open. Some locals, even decades later, still speak about the stranger. He wasn't from town. No one remembers his name, or perhaps no one wants to. Witnesses described him as a tall man in a dark coat, seen near the old railway crossing on the very day Mary vanished. It's worth noting that this spot wasn't far from where she was last seen walking. In the days before the disappearance, a handful of residents recalled spotting him around at the post office, leaning against the fence outside the bakery, watching quietly. Always alone, always in the background. Police at the time dismissed the connection. A drifter passing through wasn't unusual, especially in those years. But the details are unnerving. One woman claimed she saw Mary speaking to him, not in a friendly way, but with the kind of wary body language you notice when someone wants to end a conversation but feels they can't. Another man swore He saw the same figure walking down the road later that evening, his coat pocket bulging in a way that seemed unnatural. Could it be that Mary had some prior encounter with this stranger? Maybe she had rejected in advance, confronted him about something, or simply caught his attention in the wrong place at the wrong time. These scenarios are impossible to verify now, but they open a troubling door that her disappearance may not have been the work of anyone within her circle, but rather the act of someone completely outside it. The unsettling part is that if this theory holds any truth, it explains why the investigation stalled so quickly. In a small town, police can question every friend, neighbor, and coworker. But if the perpetrator had no ties to the area, no address, no employer, no family nearby, there's nothing to connect him to the crime. He could vanish as quietly as he appeared, taking every answer with him. There's also the matter of the letters. About 2 months after Mary vanished, her sister reportedly received an anonymous note. It was never made public in full, but excerpts leaked into local gossip. She didn't suffer, and you will never find her. The handwriting didn't match any of the primary suspects, and police could never prove it wasn't just a cruel prank. Still, those words feel like the echo of someone who knew far more than they should. Some amateur researchers believe the stranger could have been a transient railway worker or someone hopping freight trains. This fits with his repeated sightings near the crossing and might explain why no one in town knew his name. In those days, the rails were a lifeline for people moving unseen from one place to another, especially for those who didn't want to leave a paper trail. And here's the final lingering detail, one that doesn't sit comfortably in any official file. Weeks after Mary disappeared, a farmer on the outskirts claimed he found a dark overcoat tangled in the branches of a hedge. The buttons were missing, and the lining was torn. He handed it over to police, but there's no surviving record of whether it was tested or even kept. Could it have been the same coat worn by the stranger? Could it have been discarded in haste, in panic, or as an intentional attempt to erase an identity? It's hard not to wonder if Mary's case is one of those tragic examples where the truth lies far beyond the reach of anyone who knew her. If the stranger theory is correct, then the answer to what happened to her might have left town the same night she did, hidden in the mind of a man who walked away into the dark, never to be seen again. There's a moment in almost every unsolved case when the noise fades. The headlines shrink, the police updates stop, and the whispers that once stirred the neighborhood slowly fade into something more like silence. With Mary Williams' disappearance, that moment came far too soon. At first, there was momentum. Detectives chasing leads, reporters pushing for updates, and neighbors volunteering to search. Every day seemed to hold the possibility that something would break, that one more interview or one more sweep of the area would uncover the missing piece. But as weeks turned into months, that optimism began to erode. The evidence, though carefully collected, was painfully thin. There was no confirmed sighting of Mary after the afternoon she was last seen. The few pieces of physical evidence, a misplaced shoe, a cigarette butt near the bus stop, faint traces of an unfamiliar tire track, all seemed promising at first, but each led to nothing concrete. Lab testing came back inconclusive. Witness statements contradicted one another. One neighbor swore she saw Mary walking toward the grocery store just after 3 p.m., but another claimed to have spotted her heading in the opposite direction minutes earlier. A shopkeeper insisted he remembered her coming in that day, but couldn't place the exact time, and when CCTV footage from the shop was finally obtained, the crucial segment had been accidentally erased during routine tape cycling. It's these small, frustrating gaps that often prove fatal to a case. Detectives followed every plausible lead. They interviewed friends, coworkers, and even casual acquaintances, anyone who might have had reason to see or speak to Mary that day. Some suspects were quietly ruled out. Others lingered on the periphery of the investigation. Not enough evidence to arrest, but not enough to completely dismiss either. Meanwhile, the media's attention waned. In the beginning, Mary's face was everywhere, in newspapers, on television, printed on flyers taped to lampposts and cafe windows. But as other crimes and tragedies claimed the spotlight, her case slipped further down the news cycle. For a while, her family continued to speak at every opportunity, pleading for information. Yet over time, fewer journalists called and fewer articles were written. The emotional toll was crushing. Mary's parents, once open to public interviews, began withdrawing from the spotlight. They no longer trusted strangers' promises to help. Her closest friends described feeling trapped in limbo, unable to move on, yet powerless to make progress. Some kept searching privately, combing through rural back roads or knocking on doors themselves, hoping that someone somewhere had seen something they were willing to share. And still nothing. As years passed, the practical obstacles grew. Witnesses moved away. Some passed on. Details faded in memory. Evidence degraded. Leads that might have been promising in 1991 meant little in 1995, and almost nothing a decade later. Then there were the tips, those small glimmers of hope that flickered and died. A man in a neighboring county claimed to have overheard a drunken confession in a bar. Another caller swore they had seen Mary boarding a bus in a different state. Both claims unraveled quickly under scrutiny, and yet a few details have stubbornly resisted explanation. The unfamiliar tire tracks, for instance. Why did they appear near the bus stop that day, but never again in the weeks after? Or the phone call Mary reportedly received the night before she disappeared. A call her friends had left her visibly unsettled. Police traced it, but never publicly revealed who was on the other end. Those fragments still haunt the case file. Today, the case of Mary Williams remains officially unsolved, but it hasn't been entirely forgotten. Every so often, an anniversary article surfaces, reminding the public of the unanswered questions. Occasionally, new detectives review the file, bringing fresh eyes to the fading evidence. Sometimes, technology advances just enough to retest something, a fiber, a partial print, that might not have been analyzable before. But for now, the trail is cold. The truth, whatever it is out there, buried beneath layers of time, silence, and secrets. And until that missing piece is found, Mary's story will remain suspended in the unknown, because that's the cruel reality of cold cases. They don't end. They simply stop. And for those left behind, the hardest part isn't the grief, it's the not knowing. Thank you for taking the time to join me for this quiet journey into one of history's haunting, forgotten cases. Stories like this are not just about mystery. They're about real people, real lives, and the shadows they leave behind. If you've ever heard of this case before, or if you have your own thoughts on what might have happened, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Every perspective adds another piece to the puzzle, and sometimes it's those small details that lead to the biggest revelations. If you'd like to explore more of these quiet, haunting investigations, please consider subscribing. Together, we can keep these stories alive, ensuring they are never truly forgotten. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep looking into the shadows.